Very good. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Christy. Really, the whole center and Unruh team. We really appreciate it. And thank you to our DCFS team that has put in a lot of time and effort. But of course, none of this could actually take place if we didn't have, our providers that give of their own time and energy and efforts. And Steve is our Superman when it comes to our providers. I don't know, Steve, how many times we've done this with you with different groups, probably 6 or 7. I don't even really know. But I will say, on behalf of the center and the Unruh Institute, we really want to thank you for your time. It is invaluable. The input and your participation in this educational process is truly important and has really made an impact on all our students. So thank you yet again. We really appreciate that. So
you all are more than welcome. So I'm looking forward to seeing this, especially I know it's been, I'm assuming, but I know it's been a very, very different process, and I hope you were able to find some worthwhile learnings and experiences out of it that you will take on. It's definitely all of us. It's just a different world right now.
Yeah, it is. But I will say this: it's been fairly smooth transition. I think the students have done exceptionally well with our run-throughs, and we've gotten through it. And I think that is a testament to to this group of students who sort of dealt with the issues as they came along, as well as everyone else. So just by way of process, to remind everybody, we're going to go ahead and let the students do their entirety of their presentation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A at the end for anyone who would like to offer questions or comments. Of course, we always defer to our partner to offer a question or two at the beginning, but then we can certainly open it up to anyone who would like to participate in that. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to our DCFS group.
And just really quickly, a friendly reminder that anyone who is not speaking, please put yourself on mute. And students, make sure you keep your video on the entire time.
Thank you, Megan and Art. Good afternoon and welcome, distinguished guests. My name is Adam Jackman, and I'm honored to present to you, along with my fellow researchers, Arman, Nadim, Chris Boyd, Henry Zhao, and Victor Q, our project, Los Angeles DCFS, Accountability and Sustainability. Before I start, I want to extend a debt of gratitude to Professor Auerbach, Megan Ginley, El Viado, and all members of the Unruh Institute at the University of Southern California who provided assistance in completing this vital research. We truly could not have done it without their efforts. Today, our team will present findings on one of the most important, perhaps the most ignored issues in public policy today, early childhood education. According to the Center for the Developing Brain, 90% of cerebral capacity develops before children are just 5 years of age, and this early development is critical to success in later life. However, time and time again, adequate care is not provided to many of these young Americans, particularly in poorer neighborhoods. Looking at our first slide, 30 years ago, the situation was so dire in the United States that the Department of Health and Human Services actually declared child abuse and neglect a national epidemic. At the time, a 1993 study called Starting Points by the Carnegie Corporation called it the quiet crisis. They found that nearly half of infants and toddlers unable to advocate for themselves started life at a disadvantage. Nearly a quarter of families with children under the age of 3 lived in poverty. 9 out of every 1,000 infants died before the age of 1, a mortality rate higher than that of 19 other nations. And the amount of children in foster care doubled from 1987 to 1991, all while U.S. policy lagged behind with lack of parental leave and lack of subsidized childcare options. Jumping to the next slide, 18 years later, where a full generation of newborns had now become adults, national policy was still stalled. In 2011, the Corporation for National and Community Service recorded that 63% of all kindergartners begin school unprepared for lifelong learning. Children in low-income neighborhoods were faring even worse, where on average, they started kindergarten 60% behind their wealthier peers. And U.S. investment was still lacking because an average of 13 unique book titles per child could be found in middle-class areas, while in low-income neighborhoods, there was only 1 book title per 300 children. And here in 2020, young children are still left in a quiet crisis, especially in Los Angeles. In the next slide, you will see, according to the Child Care Aware of America, there are 35 states in which childcare, on average, costs more than a family's mortgage, and one of those states is California. In LA specifically, an average family making $54,000 a year spends upwards of 25% of their income on childcare, according to First 5 LA. First 5 also identifies LA as the county with most child poverty in the state of California, making it extremely hard for children of poorer families to enter kindergarten on an equal playing field as their peers. While early childhood education seems to have hit a 30-year roadblock in Los Angeles and across the country, today our presentation will focus on how the Los Angeles Department of Children and Family Services could be an influential starting point to turning this crisis around. This department has the unique position of being on the front lines of dealing with the crisis in early childhood education in the most populous county in the United States, with influence that can change public policy and practice, not only on a local level, but on a statewide and national level as well. But our team identified many areas that needed to be altered at DCFS in order to accomplish this turnaround. We embarked to find out in our research question on the next slide, what improvements can the Los Angeles Department of Children and Family Services institute to improve early childhood education? We focused on 5 main areas of development, including DCFS's internal culture, their structure and services, external culture, their relationship within the community, coordination with other agencies, relationship with actors in the field, funding and analysis of financial resources, and best practices, analysis of other public-private care systems, and how those practices could be applied to DCFS. We hope in this endeavor we can demonstrate the need for change and improvement in DCFS to inspire reform in early childhood education across the country. I will now hand it over to Zhao speaking on the internal culture of DCFS.
Thank you very much, Adam. Chris and I will be talking about the public perception reforms. As Adam mentioned, we split it into internal and external culture. So if we can move to the next slide, I'll proceed with a question about the internal culture. Now the question is, what would DCFS look like if we had a strong internal culture and strong public perception? Because without a doubt, the LA DCFS does not have the public image that it wants right now. So to answer this question, I turned to a 2005 Compton DCFS program called Point of Engagement. I turned to this program because social workers in this brand new program, as well as people who went through the child welfare process in Compton, all cited an improved public perception as specifically a cause for tangible results. For example, the time removed from home went significantly down. Reunifications went significantly up. And again, everyone cited the success was due to the improved public image. No longer did DCFS look just like they were taking kids away. Now it looked like a partner in Compton with faith-based groups and community-based groups. So if we can move to the next slide, I want to talk about specific reforms that Compton DCFS made that was so successful. The 2 that I look at in particular are local collaboration and preventive services. Now I'll go through a couple quotes from the study so you can see some of the general features that I think made each reform successful. In terms of local collaboration with local groups, the first point is that although only a few community-based organizations receive contracts, hundreds of groups count themselves as essential partners. The point here is that formal contractual relationships are often not the strongest ones. A lot of the strongest ones are informal. The second point is that the Compton DCFS made a concerted effort to engage numerous non-risk families, so many of the general public, and not just kids with open cases. Finally, the third feature is that relationships are seen as ongoing. They're not just seasonal, they're not just on and off. So those are the 3 criteria I'm going to use when we talk about the current LA DCFS to see if they meet any of these general criteria. On preventive services, the first point is that they focused on getting access to preventive services right when the first referral came in. So it's the earliest point of contact. Now that was something that was brand new for them to emphasize. Second, they emphasized including the family in the process of choosing what services they need and trusting the family to know what's best for them, to what needs they had the most. And so those are the general criteria I'm going to use. So if we move to the next slide, let's talk about these 2 types of reforms as applied to the current LA DCFS, excuse me. So I reached out to Angela Parks-Files, one of the regional directors, And I put that quote up right there in the dark blue. So I labeled it from 1 to 3 because she basically pointed out 3 types of the current relationships between CBOs and the DCFS. So the first one is a short-term relationship. It's just more informal, involving getting gifts to kids with open cases during certain seasonal times from the post office and businesses. The second type of relationship are operational agreements, where the DCFS uses some of the physical infrastructure of a local church or local group. Finally, there are the typical contractual relationships between the DCFS and nonprofits and private groups for things like prevention and aftercare, other preventive services. So what I noticed here when I apply the previous framework is that there seems to be a lack of that strongest relationship, which is informal, sustained, and with the general public. So you might be thinking, what does that strongest type of relationship look like? Is it even feasible, right? Because that looks like just an ideal criteria. But the truth is, faith-based organizations and DCFS right now already have very, very strong relationships, but they only encompass foster care. So for example, I looked at foster care ministries that have, in recent years, specifically had info fairs to let churchgoers and the general public know and have a more deep understanding about the struggle of foster care kids and what they can do to help these kids. There are also ambassador trainings. So people who are extremely interested and dedicated about the foster care system can actually continue working with the church, get trained by experts, and then they can help others navigate the foster care system. So I think this relationship is so strong. The best way we can improve it is not to reinvent the wheel, but to expand the scope. So instead of just talking about foster care and having people help with the foster care system, we have them help navigate the child welfare system overall and help direct them to preventive services and these preventive resources. And so if we could move to the next slide, I'll talk about the second point of reform. So currently, DCFS preventive services are largely facilitated by contracted nonprofits and family resource centers. Now, improving access to preventive services has already been a key emphasis in recent years. So from 2017 to 2019, the number of families connected to these supports tripled. And specific examples of these services include Shields for Families, a group that offers counseling, child development services, crisis intervention. So I think substantively, DCFS preventive services are very, very strong. The problem is with advertising and branding, letting people know they have these really, really strong services and relationships. Again, when I talked to Angela Parks-Piles, the regional director, she said they had recently created a social media position. So I went on their Facebook pages, Instagram pages, and the Instagram page in particular, when I looked at it, it had 0 followers. I checked again 2 or 3 weeks later, it had 11 followers. So this kind of using social media to target their main audience, which is young kids who might be at risk, that is an area where they have a lot of potential for growth. So on top of that, another point is that they need stronger internal culture with the receptionist when they pick up the phone, and having the early point of contact and letting everybody know that regardless of whether you have an open case or not, there is a public list of preventive services and a directory to these groups who provide them. Because when I personally called, I was getting inconsistent answers all the time. So those are the 2 potential points of improvement regarding preventive services. But otherwise, the program is already very strong. So I'll turn it over to Chris now. He'll talk a little more about the external culture side of public perception.
Oh, thank you. So my name is Christopher Boyd, and I'm dealing with the external culture of DCFS. So next slide. So when I first started my research on external culture, I just mainly wanted to see how the public's perception of DCFS, and that for me, that meant I had to look at what DCFS is doing wrong internally, thus it affected the external culture of DCFS. So when dealing with the current image, when the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services comes to mind, the first associations that we have with organizations are mismanaged, strained, and for some it's corrupt. In recent record, the deaths of several children, such as Gabriel Fernandez, 8-year-old who died on May 2013, Anthony Avalos, who passed away in 2018, and Noah Quattro, who passed away in 2019. It forced many to look up the mismanagement of DCFS. As a result, online publications and government organizations discovered underlying mistakes of DCFS that resulted in the death of these children and many more. As a result of the reporting of these mishaps, it further affected external image of DCFS in negative ways. But DCFS's poor image isn't just a result of the Gabriel Fernandez trials, which was a Netflix documentary that was released earlier this year, or even the deaths of the other children. Or even with the recent audit into May 2019 of the department. The ups and downs of the external image of DCFS has been present for years. As you can see in my image right here, there's something right there called A Culture of Fear. This was a book written in 2013 by 2 former DCFS workers it was like a 159-page book that I glanced at that discussed the mishaps and the improvements that DCFS needs in order to make its image better. So going to the next slide. After all my research, I sort of gathered, I sort of condensed it into 3 main ways in which DCFS could sort of improve its external image. One deals with improved training. The second deals with manage heavy caseloads of the workers. And the third is more general, which deals with communication. Next slide. Thank you. So for the improved training, I cited the May 2019 audit of DCFS and the Gabriel Fernandez trials, any information that I found on it, including a Netflix documentary. So in May 2019, DCFS was audited due to the number of child deaths that occurred under their watch. While the audit was a 36-page briefing of the DCFS as a whole, it simply stated that the department puts children at risk of abuse and neglect by failing to complete safety and risk assessments on time and accurately. The publication of this document was one of the several manifestations that stained the image of DCFS in recent record. While the audit publicly highlighted several issues, one fact that was accentuated in both the audit and the Netflix docuseries was that the department leaves some children in unsafe and abusive situations for months. Moreover, what should be done is that social workers, what should be done is that social workers should initiate cases within the first 10 days of receiving them. But what the audit did highlight was that a lot of social workers did not look at cases within a 40-day period, which is completely incorrect for what it should be done. And then auditors also revealed that the mistakes occurred at a frequency that cannot even be viewed as acceptable. When social workers completed their safety and risk assessments, the auditors found 40% of the assessments were reviewed as not accurate. In 2 instances, the social workers erroneously performed the safety assessments for homes and caregivers who were not subjected to the referrals. And in 3 of those instances, social workers filled out safety assessments without visiting the children's homes. Nevertheless, a lot of the things that the audit did highlight was then picked up by other publications such as the Chronicles of Social Change, the Daily News, the LA Times, and it forced other people to look into what DCFS is doing wrong, and that then resulted in people confessing their own personal experiences with DCFS on how they did not receive callbacks with cases, which deals with the communication, and moreover how DCFS just did not deal with their case in an effective manner. So that forced me then to go into my second proposition, which is managing heavy caseloads. So managing heavy caseloads has been a thing since the turn of the 21st century, basically. A lot of documents that I found with my research deals with just how DCFS is understaffed, how they, a lot of things slip through the cracks with DCFS. And back in 2002, the KDA agreement was made, which forced social workers to have an optimal caseload of 14 children cases per social worker. But in LA County, what I found was that DCFS workers usually have a caseload of over 30 cases. And moreover, the ratio of workers to supervisors within the recent years did not match the optimal ratio that the state of California requested out of DCFS as well. So a lot of the case, due to the fact that DCFS is the largest organization of its kind with, in a given month, it looks over 30,000 children, a lot of the, and on top of that, it's being understaffed, it is inevitable for the organization to have certain mishaps. Recurrent headlines of DCFS being understaffed has been a trend since the early 2000s. And moreover, in articles written about the Gabriel Fernandez trials, Greg Merritt, which was one of the social workers who was part of the case, he wrote that he simply, when he received the case, he simply looked over the headline and moved it to the side and verified it, which is something that a lot of, which is not okay out of the workers. And when this was written by the Atlantic, a lot of people did comment on how DCFS just does not know how to train their workers and things like that. And people, again, gave their own opinions on forum pages online. And this deals with the training on how workers are just simply glancing over material instead of thoroughly looking them over, because these are children's lives that they're looking after. But it also deals with just that heavy caseload. Greg did say that he had a lot of cases of similar status on his desk and that he constantly received more and more and more cases. So it was inevitable for him to just just simply glance over something and overlook it, and then something to go wrong. So in my opinion, in a way that we could fix this was just like acknowledge that DCFS has to acknowledge that that the high caseloads lead to poor outcomes, and moreover, possibly look at ways that they could do worker quality assessments and stuff like that instead of once a year, but increase it to like twice a year. And then my last proposition deals with communication. So in the middle of the page in bold was a quote made by the Mercury Public Affairs, which did a report of DCFS in 2018. There's a lack of DCFS branding that leads to confusion and at times poor customer service with resources families during the process. One thing that I did find constantly was just that the communication efforts, both internally and externally with DCFS, stains the image of DCFS as a whole, because while internally supervisors and social workers do not have a way of effective communication when it comes to critical cases, but externally when people call in for DCFS to report of a case of abuse, those people will not receive a call back for weeks, or if they even get a call back, which in my opinion affects the external image of and external trust that the community has in DCFS. This is something that happened with the Noah Quattro case, the 4-year-old who passed away. Somebody reported his abuse, but then DCFS never followed up with it, and it resulted in a mishap of the department. And then going back to Noah's death, it forced individuals to investigate communication efforts between LAPD and DCFS. In January 2020, the Los Angeles Daily News and the Chronicles of Social Change disclosed to the public that LAPD did not investigate 4,000 allegations of serious child abuse from January 2018 to June 2019. And this is as a result of the communication software that DCFS has with the LAPD. These 4,000 cases did get lost in the system. And with that, it just, it did not create a good external image of DCFS. So with that, my suggestion for the communication efforts was to continue to push something that they started this year, which was the Invest LA Community Engagement Forum in the San Fernando Valley and Santa Clarita Valleys. This is what Invest LA did in order to help DCFS communicate better with the communities to see what they could do better for everyone else, to ensure that stakeholders from unique and diverse communities across LA are being heard and that all their cases are being dealt with. Furthermore, what New York City's Department of Children and Family Services did was that they created an app that allowed people within the community to help one another out when their DCFS department is not doing enough for them. So this is something that the department suggested in 2016 via one of their hackathons, and the community suggested it, and DCFS actually went through and completed the app, and this is something that they started earlier this year. So in my opinion, like, I believe that this would be a great opportunity for LA County's DCFS to create something of similar nature in order to ensure that everyone's being heard, or if DCFS is overworked, that the community at least has others that they could talk to. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the coordination with other agencies, which is done by Arman.
Thank you, and we can go to the first slide. Next slide, yeah. So currently there are a variety of different actors involved in early childhood improvement. For example, Department of Mental Health, Department of Education, Public Health, and then there's private actors like First 5 LA, Welcome Baby, and all these different actors have their own like partnerships that they work with independently. So while these private and public institutions are collectively working towards the common goal of family improvement, they each have their own individual strategies and modes of operation, along with the partners that they're working with in the community. So the problem then arises that because these agencies are working semi-independently, it becomes difficult to coordinate and communicate between these actors, which is a problem because they are all working towards a similar goal, but they're not sharing and the information as well as they could. For example, on DCFS's website, while they do try to refer to other departments such as mental health, education, and public health, it's very hard for this information to come by for the average person, as Chris and Henry have alluded to. Yet this information is very crucial to DCFS because there is a lot of good information out there, as Henry said, but people just need help knowing where to look, which can get very confusing, especially with all the different actors involved. So the ultimate goal that we want to move towards would be for each agency to keep their integrity and what they believe is their best way of mode of operating, while still willing to adequately share resources and coordinate centrally for the main goal of family and childhood improvement. And while ensuring the ability of the public, we want to make sure they have access and the use of the multitude of these ideas and information in an easier and more efficient manner. So now if we go to the next slide. So the Los Angeles County of Perinatal and Early Childhood Home Visitation Consortium, it's a network of many different actors across the spectrum of childhood home visitation, and they provide a central hub for all of these different actors and organizes the central goal. However, it is quite messy and it is somewhere in between formal and informal, which makes it very difficult to organize. However, making it a more formal and definitive central oversight can be a key collective improvement in children's lives, because ultimately what this consortium provides is help for home visitation programs, which each agency is currently doing independently. It connects all the agencies through standards, which train each agency's home visitors to be able to effectively refer to families. Go back to the next slide. I think you went back one. Yeah. No, go, yeah. So it connects all the agencies through standards which train each agency's home visitors to be able to effectively refer families to all the different agencies and private actors which may be beneficial to them. And the key to DCFS and the public health of the community is not only getting this information to the people, as Henry and Chris have talked about, but helping them use the information through the language barriers that people have, through economic barriers and other challenges that require intensive home visitations as early as possible to plant the seeds for successful parenthood. Also, instead of these families having to see referrals to use these programs, home visitors can help put them in contact directly, which makes it much easier on the families to get help. Now, the importance of these home visitations have been shown across a variety of studies that they've improved pregnancy outcomes for both mother and baby. It's decreased rates of child abuse and neglect, improved intellectual developments, basically everything that DCFS is aiming for. And it's shown that investments in home visitation and getting people access to the information that's already there has proven down the line to save money in the economic and health, from economic and health improvement of the families. So the current problems with the consortium, as mentioned earlier, are the central guidelines and the certifications range from formal to informal, and these agencies are often still working more on the independent side of things. Also, there's a vast amount of improvement needed to get this information to the public. For example, there's 32,000 at-risk moms per year, but the capacity through all the actors working, we can only reach about 9,000 intensive home visits, which is an extended period of time. If we're just talking about getting this information to everyone in LA, we're even farther apart, as there's around like 123,000 births per year, and the current combined capacity for less intrusive home visits or just calls is only around 25,000. So there's a lot of untapped potential for getting people this information and referring them to the agency which they need specifically. Now, the lack of a strong central home visitation program has been made evident recently, as there's been publicity about New York's ability to continue home visitations during the coronavirus through Zoom and phone calls. Meanwhile, many of LA programs have halted or have completely, or just doing it very sparingly. And this just shows the discrepancy between New York and LA in a time when people need information the most, and kids being born at the most risk right now. LA is falling short on reaching out to people and referring them adequately. So now if we go to the next slide, we're gonna see DCFS's specific role. It first starts with taking care of their own responsibility, which is they need to increase their referrals for home visitation as an agency. First off, the preventative home visitation participation for DCFS is currently quite small compared to its overall size. And as mentioned, there's a large gap that needs to be filled with parents who just need information, guidance, referrals to all these different programs, which many don't have yet. Because of DCFS's size and influence, if DCFS does a strong push towards legitimizing and formalizing the consortium's home visitation guidelines and certification, that would not only allow for DCFS to refer people to all different agencies across LA, but it would promote those agencies themselves to have a strong focus in participating with the consortium and the central goal as well. Because of how complex this network is, DCFS must also be more proactive about data sharing, both with the public agencies involved and the private networks, because in total there's over 50 working throughout this home visitation network, and they all should be able to share with each other the best practices, the outcome results, which allows agencies to learn and build off one another to see what's working and what's not. The central database should also have central oversight through the consortium, preferably, to ensure its formalization and access to every actor working in this field. Lastly, and probably the hardest part, of course, is always funding. Currently, only around 1 to 2% 1 to 2% of DCFS's budget goes towards this preventative network, probably even less based off which number you use, like pre or like if you include the number of including salaries, which is why current capacity is so low. So we know how hard it is to generate funding, but also we do know that if we invest in a strong preventative network of home visitation, it pays itself off and then some down the line. So a short-term subsidy or a reallocation of funds, while it may stretch the budget or allow other aspects to lose a little bit of funding, would decrease DCFS's workload in 10, 15, 20 years going forward by essentially strengthening other preventative and agencies working in LA, so the weight on DCFS's shoulders can slowly be reduced. So now I'm going to hand it over to Victor, who's going to talk about possibilities of finding this small bit of funding which can go towards these programs.
Thank you, Arman. My name is Victor, and in this section, I will examine the funding structure for DCFS, as well as future opportunities and efforts for sustainable funding solutions. Data sourced from the LA Controller's budget and DCFS shows that their budget is currently over $2.4 billion annually, and there are multiple streams of funding sources and mechanisms that allow DCFS to build a robust fiscal infrastructure that ensures public, private, and nonprofit investments to reach at-risk populations. Currently, DCFS's infrastructure for funding is similar to comparable agencies across the United States. For example, in both New York City and Washington states, comparable agencies, they're funded by a combination of federal, state, and local funds, mostly in the form of grants. All three agencies also work with a robust coalition of public-private partnerships with foundations, centers, charitable trusts, and other nonprofit organizations. Okay, sorry. First, I'll examine public funding and programs. The strength of public funding is that it's the biggest pot of money, and therefore it's the most sustainable source of funding for DCFS. A key legislative policy in LA regarding early childhood education funding was proposed by Council Member David Ryu last year. This program, named Opportunity LA, provides children ages 0 through 18 enrolled in LAUSD a dedicated savings account with a $50 seed deposit. So it gives the most at-risk, people who are most at risk, a good start in their funding development. In terms of LA County, a major early childhood education funder is First 5 LA, which is an independent public agency that funds early health, nutrition, language, and literacy development. Since their founding in 1998, they've invested over $2.2 billion to partner with local county organizations for project initiatives and operations. At the state level, Senate Bill 114 and Assembly Bill 114, which was passed in mid-2019, will supplement over $100 million in addition to the current $142 million to the State Department for an early learning and care infrastructure grant program, which will expand access to early childhood education and care opportunities through facilities and services which are newly implemented. These bills also establish the Early Childhood Policy Council, which will advise the governor, legislature, and superintendent on early childhood learning and care policy. In terms of federal funding, Head Start is a program of the United States Department of Health and Human Services that provides a comprehensive child development and family support service to low-income children and families. And overall, public funding provides the infrastructure and foundation for DCFS to run the necessary programs that they need with the big systems in place. In terms of private and nonprofit organization funding, the strengths of these funds are that they're very nimble so that they can be used to fund more adventurous projects as opposed to the specific allocations that public funding requires. Currently, DCFS works with the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment and LA Education Partnership, which are partnerships between foundations and public departments. And DCFS can continue to tap into this robust coalition of community organizations for funding and specific partnerships. In the future, DCFS can explore partnering with the Bezos Family Foundation, which is passionate and dedicated about early learning funding. They have a program called Vroom, which is a program for early childhood education. It's an app and resource that provides science-based brain building exercises and tips to create a strong foundation for early learning. Some of their example partners include New York City, Oregon, Washington, and other nationwide and state and local departments. Currently, Vroom has over 1.5 million users across 37 states. And in terms of locally in LA County, some of the top nonprofit funders for early childhood education include the Ahamson Foundation, California Community Foundation, the Keck Foundation, and the Weinhardt Foundation. So in terms of that, DCFS can tap into different funding programs and opportunities that local nonprofit funders provide for early childhood education. In terms of future funding efforts and actions, first, there needs to be more public investment into early childhood education. Specifically, in the 2019 to 2020 state budget, Governor Gavin Newsom included $2.3 billion in the following early childhood investments, which includes facilities, long-term master plan, subsidized child care access, grants, and data analysis. Although this may seem significant, California's investments today in early childhood education is still more than $1 billion lower compared to 2007 and 2008, as these fundings for the programs was cut dramatically during and after the Great Recession. In addition, more Prop 98 allocations will add to the public investment that was previously talked about, that there needs to be more government allocated budgets for this. In terms of DCFS, they started a program called Invest LA, where they partner with local nonprofits and different community organizations and businesses in order to build and foster partnerships and relationships with the community. And in doing so, this partnership was started late last year, and that will provide a more robust foundation for DCFS to continue working with local nonprofits and local community organizations, since the Invest LA is dedicated to promoting the safety, permanency, and well-being for children. And the priority of this program is threefold. First, it's to strengthen children, youth, and families. Second is to strengthen workforce excellence. And third is to develop community and cross-sector partnerships. And this will give the opportunity for DCFS to shape the future and ensure healthy and safe families while elevating child welfare reform. And finally, policymakers should work with nonprofit donors to maximize dollar use, and a specific action towards this will be for DCFS to look into partnering with the Bezos Family Foundation, since they have been so successful in partnering with other similar agencies across the United States. And now Adam will discuss the best practices.
Thank you, Victor. In this final section of our presentation, I will be focusing on best practices. Here, I will highlight the practices of some of the most successful non-governmental and private actors in the field of early childhood education and what DCFS can learn from them. I specifically chose organizations and programs that have existed over a long period of time and had a broad geographic scope to ensure that these practices had the statistical significance to hold up in a diverse community like LA County and could be employed for years to come, as early childhood education is an ongoing and developing process by nature. On the next slide is my first example, the Parents as Teachers program. This program strives to provide at-home visitation for families to help train parents to be the best first educators for their children. Arman spoke extensively on the impact of home visitation, and this program demonstrates that this policy is extremely successful across the country and within every demographic, community, and geographic location. Started at the local level in Missouri with just 4 sites on the state in 1981, the program has expanded to all 50 states and across 2,000 sites in 2020. Parents as Teachers home visitation in initiatives are actually teaching parents and including them in the education of their children. Affirmed by over 40 respected and independent research organizations like the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare, an analysis of the effect of Parents as Teachers in 2019 demonstrates that the organization has made massive advances in child health care, poverty, and parent relationships. Parents as Teachers parents were more likely to enroll their children in preschool, attend parent-teacher conferences, PTA and PTO meetings, and school events, volunteer in the classroom, and talk with their children's teacher. Annually, Parents as Teachers finds approximately 32,000 newly identified developmental delays or health and hearing or vision concerns in children. Also, Parents as Teachers is able to track these results using various data models, including the Personal Visit Observation Tool, Group Connection Observation Tool, and Family File Review Tool, in which supervisors can track children's and families' long-term growth over a period of 4 or 5 years. These practices by Parents as Teachers demonstrate that in order to achieve successful results in early childhood education reform, holistic reform needs to be the goal. Parents as Teachers is dedicated to long-term results by not just offering solutions, but showing parents how implementation change across, showing how parents can implement change across a broad diversity in their everyday lives. As Arman said earlier in the presentation, only 1% of DCFS funding goes to home visitation, and as evidence in these findings, that needs to change. In the next slide, I will highlight Healthy Families America. Starting out of the Head Start program in 1992, with over 600 locations nationwide in 2020, HFA strives to provide prenatal care to expecting mothers to bridge the gap in early childhood education. This means that HFA prenatally enrolls mothers in order to provide resources to children from birth and keeps them enrolled with family planning. When moms enroll in HFA before the 3rd trimester, according to data from 19 publications of randomized controlled trials, 70% of pregnancy complications are reduced, and the rate of low birth weight is reduced by 48%, which greatly improves cognitive ability and development in young children as they move along in life. HFA also has demonstrated the financial incentives to invest in early childhood education resources like DCFS. In a study in Hampton, Virginia, for example, from 1994 to 2005, which you can see on your screen, since HFA was able to engage with parents to help children early on, they actually decreased the need for programs like Child Protective Services, developmental education services, and community support organizations. This resulted in Hampton paying less than half for these programs compared to the statewide average in Virginia, proving that the initial cost of HFA paid off significantly in the long run. In comparison to DCFS in LA, Hampton has the same population as Santa Monica and roughly the same racial diversity, demonstrating the ability for these practices to apply to LA's unique social environment. HFA's practices demonstrate that by using prenatal recognition and framing early childhood education in the long term, rather than just using quick solutions, real results can be achieved. My final slide concerns the action within the private sector that DCFS can use to improve their programming. I first wanted to highlight the Community Reinvestment Act as a stream for potential financing of DCFS. Victor brilliantly pointed out that many local and state programs that DCFS can draw funding from, and with this federal act, DCFS can draw funds from the private sector as well as the local level. The act requires federally insured mortgage lending institutions to make funding available for community and neighborhood reinvestment at affordable interest rates. This means that institutions like banks can identify childcare as a community need under the CRA and make loans to providers like DCFS as part of their obligations to assist low and moderate income neighborhoods. This is an opportunity that DCFS could use to provide much needed funding out of a resource that they probably didn't even realize was available to them. Overall, I believe these best practices can provide examples of reform that have worked over a significant period of time and geographic scope. These reforms are most important because they can be applied to DCFS and add to locally based solutions proposed by my fellow researchers. Now I will turn it back over to Victor Q with the final part of our presentation, which is the recommendations.
Thank you, Adam. And now we'll offer our final set of recommendations for Steve to possibly consider looking into for DCFS. Our first recommendation is to expand the scope of current faith-based relationships to not just foster care, but the child welfare system. Expand communication of existing services using social media and improving their priority by receptionists. Assess workers more frequently in order to ensure that they are following their original training and not submitting mistakes. Continue to create and push community engagement efforts so that they are publicized. Work towards increasing DCFS's role in home visitation programs. Be proactive in data sharing and creating a cooperative network. Advocate for more public investment to stimulate early learning for low-income and disadvantaged communities. Partner with more nonprofits to build stronger community-based funding and programming. Present economic benefits in the long run to secure funding. And finally, focus on tracking child development using modeling and data collection. And we'd like to thank Steve and the Unruh Institute for their time and effort for this project. And now we'll take questions.
Very good. Congratulations, team. I think you all did a wonderful job. You can all take a deep breath and relax for a little bit. We're going to go ahead and turn it over to Steve to start our Q&A. But again, I just want to emphasize, it was clear you all put a great deal of time and effort into your presentation and did a fine job. So Steve, how about if I turn it over to you to start the conversation?
Yeah, no, thanks, Art. And yeah, really good job, all of you. Some great detail, and the presentation was really good. And I think most importantly, you all showed sort of different levels of the kind of creative and critical thinking, where it wasn't just here's the information I got, but you did some synthesis and sort of within your own sections, coming up with with some critical thinking and sort of the what does this mean, or what's the import here, and that's really, again, in the sense of this internship, trying to mirror kind of the way the consulting world works. That's what clients are looking for, right? Is here, based on our expertise, our research, our experience, we're pulling this together, and we think these are the key, our key findings and our key recommendations. And I think you have those individually, and then you have them here at the end. And I sort of want to start with those recommendations. And this is broadly to any and all of you who want to answer it. But I'm wondering, in this kind of 2-page list of recommendations, are there one or two that you think you'd start with, that you think have the most potential, that might have the biggest impact?
Who wants to take a stab at that?
I think I can tackle it.
Go ahead, Arman.
I think we can all agree that there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of programs that DCFS has, not only with their partners, but also with throughout the community. So I think what's really key is, first off, getting people to access to the programs that DCFS provides, because that's most important. If people don't know what DCFS is doing, then everything kind of falls apart, because then you have to work on branding, you have to tell them. So just getting them information, pointing them to the right direction through like language barriers, through economic barriers, I think is the first key step in really improving DCFS. Because I think the majority, even you probably didn't know too much directly about DCFS other than the headlines we hear. So I think it's key that people have a better understanding of just what DCFS is doing and what they can provide.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think one of the points, if you go back to the first recommendation slide, was the home visitation programs, which Arman and I touched on. And this was a specific recommendation, but I think it does apply to many areas in terms of funding and external and internal culture, that there needs to be some sort of more holistic change in DCFS, that it's not just a quick fix. It does require an initiative, and it does require people putting in the time and effort into this very personal program. So I think Arman and I conveyed why it would be very necessary, and I think Victor, Henry, and Chris all conveyed that it would help external and internal culture, and the funding can be made available for it. So I think it involves all of our research aspects, and it definitely is a specific recommendation, but I think it definitely applies to a lot of what we were talking about.
Great. Are there comments from the team or any of these recommendations that any of you see as sort of maybe the easiest / important components that can be sort of resolved rather, I don't want to say quickly, but maybe on the easier side than some of the bigger picture ideas?
I might have a bias because I'm going to bring up one of my own recommendations.
Okay, that's fine, Andrew.
Yeah, I think one of the easier ones is, again, that first one I mentioned, regarding expanding the existing foster care-based relationships with like a foster care ministry, and expand the scope to focus on also helping to navigate the child welfare system, right? And a lot of these churches right now already talk a lot about the biblical mandate to help foster care kids. And that's the kind of thing you can just expand on, because those relationships already exist, right? The info fairs, ambassador trainings. So I think those are the kinds of solutions that are going to be easiest, is where you already have something and you just expand the scope a little bit, as opposed to trying to reinvent the wheel. Because we have to show some respect to the really hardworking people at DCFS already. Like I guarantee they've thought about most things already. And our job is, I think, maybe more just to give them a different perspective, tweaks, because I trust that on the fundamental stuff, a lot of the possible reforms they've already thought about.
Before you go, Chris, and maybe you can even address this, one of the concerns I would have is that you're talking about a really significant bureaucracy, and bureaucracies are not necessarily known for being terribly nimble and able to make changes. Chris, do you see this as something that can be, that almost you can change the mentality of large governmental institutions, that change is really viable? Or do you think that it's just sort of, it's almost so big that real change is not viable?
I'm going to sort of answer this from the perspective of like my section, and I truthfully do believe that, like, yes, like changes, like changing the image and like the understanding of something the size of DCFS is very much so possible, and it deals with just communication. One thing, when I first started my research as a New Yorker, I was sort of biased in like looking up and comparing DCFS to the same organization in New York, and to sort of see what New York is doing differently, what they're doing better, what they're doing worse, et cetera, et cetera. But what in New York they do is that they constantly update the Twitter pages, they constantly update the forum pages on their websites. The communication is top notch compared to what compared to DCFS here. And with that, like, the governor has such a great image to the people of New York City because of the fact that he's constantly discussing the funds that are being poured into DCFS over there, and sort of just making sure that people have a great understanding of what is going on. And if there were any mishaps, he was there to both the director of the organization and Governor Cuomo constantly just made sure that there was just full transparency. And with that transparency, it helped out the image in the best ways possible, because whether, as a New Yorker, when I look at this, like, I understand if there's something wrong, they're going to address it. If they're doing things right, it's nice to hear that they're going in the right direction, you know? And that is something that I feel as if DCFS should do more of. And that will ultimately help out the overall image of what of the organization as a whole. Like, sort of just addressing, just sending out a newsletter, or just addressing their past failures in a precise manner, you know? That'll just put it in a better light than what it is now. And I'm not saying it's in a lot of people think that DCFS is like the villain here, but it will help them out regardless, whatever view or opinion people have of them, if they would just improve that transparency.
So I had a question for Chris that's related to this. First, I want to say DCFS is not the villain, but New York City, of course, is the villain. Don't forget that, Chris. And but my question was, did you find, or did you get a sense, because you talked about kind of culture issues and then the external communication, and which I think are two critical points. But did you find that there were any culture issues that maybe contributed to, this lack of external communication? In this case, the New York department seemingly doing a much better job. But is there something? Is it that defensiveness that's just been built up in DCFS, or is there something else going on that they need to grapple with, to improve those communications?
Being that it's an organization, like a lot bigger organization than the one in New York, they're doing a great job with just the different cultures here and like just the sheer size of Los Angeles County. But it's just the defensive, in my opinion, it is part of like just the defensive responses and stuff like that did affect DCFS. I didn't really look into things the residents' opinions culturally, but so I can't really speak upon that. That is something that I should have definitely done. Now looking back on it, just hearing the view, what the people have to say. But it was just mostly the defensive culture of DCFS that sort of lost. That's why people sort of lost the trust in what they do.
Yep, that makes sense. Art, I could keep going, but I'm happy to open it up for others to ask some questions too.
Sure. Do we have anyone else who would like to chime in, or?
Yeah, Erica had asked about what the most impactful or surprising information that the students came across with doing the project.
Who wants to tackle that? Anyone?
I know for mine, when I was trying to find like the budget, first off, it's very hard to find the budget of DCFS, and it's even harder to find what they're doing with the money. But like just on the sheer size of the budget, I didn't know it was that big. Like I think it was upwards of maybe 2 billion, but then once you take into account like salaries, it comes back down. But it is a huge organization, and they have a lot of money going to different places. And kind of speaking on what Chris said, they're not transparent as much as they could be with where this money's going, and they don't release to the public like concise information on, this is a large amount of taxpayer money that I think would be beneficial if people who had more idea of where it was going and how it was being used. That was just something surprising for me, just seeing the number of how big this organization is and how much funding it is getting. It's pretty surprising.
Yeah. Let me dovetail on that, Steve, if I might.
Yep.
Has DCFS, look, I almost see DCFS in some way almost like LAUSD. It's this behemoth out there that has gotten so big, perhaps it's unworkable. Has there ever been any discussion about decentralizing it at all, or is that just nothing that's even worth considering?
I did find some minor information about how DCFS sort of split up its tasks to smaller organizations that did open up, smaller departments, excuse me, that did open up within the greater DCFS umbrella, sort of like, you know, switching, like dividing children and families to like one just dealing with children and then dealing with the foster care system. But sort of going back to the question of what was most surprising to me was how hard it was to find that information. Like, you know, scouring the web, like we're 10 weeks into research, and I sort of found a lot of information within like week 7, you know, when I was doing like, you know, just research prior to that on like just trying to find the relationship that DCFS has with other organizations or what they did in order to improve their image or like address certain issues. But yeah, one thing I recently did find was how they just sort of tried to divide up the caseload in order to alleviate social workers, like the caseload of social workers within the DCFS umbrella.
Great, thank you. Other comments or questions from anyone out in our virtual world?
Art?
Yeah, Bob.
First of all, I thought this was terrific. I think you guys did a great job. Secondly, you have a set of recommendations. They obviously cost a fair amount of money. And I really guess I would pose 2 questions. Do you have any sense of what the total cost of these recommendations are? And how do we get the revenues for them? How do we get the resources for them when COVID-19 is sopping up so much of the government's money?
Great question. Holy cow. What do we, you know, I mean, hopefully we don't live with COVID forever, but certainly, you know, we seem like we have, you know, various needs for funding. How can this actually get done? Anyone have any ideas about the best means of sort of achieving the goals we've all put together here?
The most obvious answer would be more debt, like everyone's taking on.
Well, I'm not sure that's the best answer, but I guess it's an answer.
I mean, yeah, because I mean, Corona is such a weird thing because no one's really thinking long term. I mean, even the Federal Reserve, or Jerome Powell, like 2 days ago, said we're just not gonna regard long term financial issues. We're just gonna do everything that's necessary to stay afloat, and then hope that once Corona's done, we can kind of address these bigger issues. So I think first off, people need information now. So if it means acquiring a little more debt to try and help people during like one of the hardest times probably LA's faced in maybe ever, I think it would be worthwhile considering the entire country is kind of going down this route.
Arman, is it your sense that DCFS is underfunded at this point?
No, I think it's, in my opinion, it's way overfunded, but the problem is that a lot of the funding it's kind of like a loop where you put in money, but then you need more money to sustain the thing. So that's why I really think preventative measures and like home visitation programs are important, because in 20 years, there will be less need to keep funding. And it kind of gets you out of the loop of like eternal oversight that is going on now, in my opinion. But that's obviously a discussion of big government, small government, which gets a little out there.
And just to add on to what Arman is saying and address the point about the coronavirus, you know, Chris mentioned that New York City is still doing the programs where they're going on video chat and they're making sure that that families are taken care of. So if you're talking about immediate, you know, resources, that doesn't need to be funded, I don't think at all. I mean, you just have to figure out the logistics of getting that set up, which obviously New York City has been able to do. Why can't LA do that? personally, I don't think that's an issue of funding. I just think that's an issue of allocation of resources and allocation of time management to be able to set that up. So if you're talking about coronavirus and that immediate impact, and as Professor Auerbach said, it's not going to be, hopefully a problem that we have to deal with forever. But if you're talking about that immediate effect, I think figuring out a structure and being, a bit more nimble, I think would be beneficial. Obviously, that's a very hard thing to do right now, but I think New York City set, evidence that can be done.
Great thoughts. We are sort of pushed on our time, but I do want to give Steve a last opportunity for another question or so. Steve, anything, either a question or comments you'd like to offer at this point?
Yeah, no, so I'm absolutely, and I am going to end up directing a question that I think was related to what we were just talking about to one of you. But one of the things that, and Arman, you're talking about, it's fun on Zoom when you say somebody's name and they pop up. Sorry, Arman, you were checking your email. I apologize. Whatever you know. But you make this good point of like the preventative spending and home visiting and some of these other programs. You spend X amount up front and you get X plus a bunch of dollars in savings down the line. It's amazing how much that can fall on deaf ears with, because, I have found that, our electeds are, even when it's not a crisis, they're very focused on kind of at most their, the end of their term in office or getting reelected. But that is certainly, a message that we keep pushing. I think, seeing, the workers that we're talking about kind of being looped into, being essential workers is a new and interesting way of thinking about some of the programs that you guys have been looking at over the last few weeks. So, something to look forward to see if that kind of continues. But around the sort of funding and sustainability, and the question is Victor, is kind of going your way. Because you talked about partnering with some new private funders among other funders like Bezos and others, and I'm wondering if sort of given all the issues that have been raised sort of throughout this conversation, the external issues, some of the internal, are there ways that you think DCFS could sort of maybe present a best face towards these funders or do the best job of sort of selling themselves, given that they probably have some hurdles to overcome in starting that conversation?
Sure, that's definitely a concern that I explored. But in terms of that, it's critical to look at what other organizations have done as well. So when you look at New York, when you look at Seattle, when you look at Oregon, they've partnered with organizations such as the Bezos Family Foundation, even though they might have their own issues as well. And I don't think that those nonprofits are specifically examining and looking at issues, looking deeply into the issues of DCFS, rather how they can promote or best introduce their programming into partnerships with DCFS. So for like Vroom, it's pretty non-political or non-issue because they like to promote early learning, and it's an app and a resource. So just being able to partner with those organizations and get their help and partnerships through their programming is critical. And I don't believe that the organizations will look deeply into whether the issues of external or internal communication and how the criticism or the problems that DCFS may have will play a large factor in whether the nonprofits will want to partner or not, because I think their overall goal is to just get their resources and get their programming out to the public department and be able to help as many people as possible.
Wonderful. Well, again, we're sort of pushed on time, so I think we'll go ahead and call it. But I do want to say I think you guys all did just a wonderful job. Again, through the help and assistance of Steve, we really appreciate all the efforts for everybody, and in particular, Steve, for the time and efforts that you put in with the center year in and year out. It is much appreciated. So thank you as always. Just one or two housekeeping facts before we go ahead and close out this meeting. One, please keep in mind that your paper is due Monday by 12 noon. You're going to upload that on Blackboard. Steve, I'll have those papers for you later on in the week once I can get those graded. And I'll just email them over to you if that's okay. And then do keep in mind, in terms of your workshop write-ups, those go to Ellie Vieto. And in terms of political event, your write-up that's due, that goes on Blackboard. So unless we have any other issues, Megan, anything we need to mention or discuss?
Nope, we're good.
Okay, very good.
Before everybody leaves. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Christy.
Thanks, Art. So great job, everyone. Definitely learned a lot. And Steve, so we're going to be putting the recording and slides and a beautiful wrap-up on the website like we usually do, and we'll make sure to send it to you. But we also want photos to be there. So if everybody can help me take a photo, that'd be great. Megan, if you want to come on.
And Victor, if you can X out of the PowerPoint for the picture so Christy has a photo.
Thank you. And then, so if everyone can throw up a fight on and then just keep it there for like 20 seconds, I'm going to take a couple screenshots. Thank you. Okay, that's great. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Great job, King. Congratulations. Your research presentation is over. Steve, thank you again, as always. Much appreciated. And I believe that is the end. So good job, gang, and we'll look forward to reading your papers on Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining, Bob.